In 1974, Mel Brooks killed the Western genre.
Yes?
The murder weapon was a film, Blazing Saddles. You might be wondering how that could even be possible. The idea that any given piece of media could influence its own medium to the degree that it could outright kill a genre as storied as the Western seems ludicrous. I mean, Westerns are still coming out, right? Well, yes, but how many? A couple a year? If that? In the period running from the 50s up until the 70s, hundreds of Westerns would be released annually, both on the silver screen and the small screen. And people were starting to get sick of it. It's comparable to the superhero fatigue that we have today, and like superhero films, they would just keep coming out. So Mel Brooks, seeing this endless sea of basically the same type of movie, had a funny idea. If everyone had a cultural familiarity with the tropes and cliches of these films, you could make a movie that played off those same cliches for gags. And that's exactly what he did. Blazing Saddles lampooned every single tired trope that the Westerns had, demystifying them, not by exposing them as being false romanticizations of a brutal and dangerous time in American history, but showing how ridiculous it must have been to live through them. And how ridiculous the films it was spoofing were in kind. It deflated the masculine bravado of the cowboy archetype and pointed a finger at the racism of the setting.
Good morning, ma'am. And isn't it a lovely morning? Up yours!
All while casting a black lead in the film, with Cleavon Little, in a time in which every Western was led by some famous white guy. There are some who would say that you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today.
You know. Morons.
And they're right, you couldn't, but not for the reasons that they probably think. Many of the jokes require the viewer to have an intimate familiarity and experience of watching a deluge of cowboy movies in the 50s and 60s. Viewing the film today just doesn't hit the same way.
Impressed?
Most people born within the last 40 years don't have an experience of watching an endless sea of Western films as they grew up. But for the people who did live through that flood of Western films, it was bold.
Do your best.
It was outrageous.
Hey, boys! Look what I got here! Hey, where are the white women at?
And it was unignorable. And people saw it in droves, it making over $119 million in the box office. To put that in perspective, adjusted for inflation, that's over $787 million in today's money. After Blazing Saddles' massive success, the Western genre petered out, only existing as either period pieces or deconstructions. They were, at least in the form that they took in their prime, killed off. So what does that have to do with horror games? Well, shockingly, something similar happened to them in the mid-2000s. One piece of work emerged from the shadows to shift the direction not only of its own genre, but gaming as a whole. The waves it made nearly spelled ruin for the horror genre, smothering it under a tide of dominance that its influence wrought. That game's name is Resident Evil 4, and it killed the horror genre by complete accident.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Released in 2005 to massive critical and commercial success, the game functionally invented the third-person camera system that most third-person shooters use today. Before RE4 came along, if you wanted to fire a gun in any given third-person video game, you would be presented with two scenarios. You would either be given very little precision, having to vaguely point your character's body at what you wanted to hit, and then fire away, hoping that it would land. Or a game would grind to a halt, stopping you in your tracks and reposition the camera to allow a better perspective for your shot, usually the first-person perspective. Both had major drawbacks, but any attempt to marry the freedom of movement of the former and the precision of the latter resulted in varying degrees of failure, usually something incredibly clunky to control. This problem was so widespread, it made the whole sixth generation of games have this sense of mechanical absence to them. Third-person shooters simply did not exist in the way that they do now. For example, playing a game like Metal Gear Solid 3 in the present day makes it feel like there's this hole in the game's mechanics where an over-the-shoulder aiming system had been surgically extracted. In fact, when it was remade earlier this year, the most significant change they made, aside from the graphics, was an addition of the same kind of third-person aiming system that RE4 inspired. And it feels like it slots right in. But in 2004, they simply couldn't figure it out. MGS3 came out less than a year before Resident Evil 4, and a year after its release, Gears of War came out. In the span of less than 2 years, the industry went from a game that failed to make third-person shooting work to releasing the quintessential modern third-person cover shooter. That's what Resident Evil 4 did when it released. If you've played any other third-person shooter over the past 20 years, you've played something inspired by Resident Evil 4. That's how fundamental and foundational the shift the game's influence was. From positioning the camera to how it feels to aim, RE4 wrote the book on how to make a good third-person shooter, and the games industry would memorize it cover to cover. The amount of third-person shooters in the 7th generation of gaming was staggering, but the flood had a knock-on effect for more niche genres, one of them being Resident Evil's home: horror. Resident Evil 4 was a major departure from the rest of its series. The reason why was in large part due to how horror games were performing financially. What was once a type of game that saved Capcom, the company that made Resident Evil, is now becoming its albatross. So what happened to horror? In 1996, Capcom had been bleeding money due to a myriad of underperforming projects, and the seemingly endless well of money that was Street Fighter II seemingly had begun to dry up. There was this serious possibility that Capcom, as a studio, could have dissolved due to these money problems. And in this tumultuous time, Shinji Mikami, inspired by the Famicom title Sweet Home, would lead the development of Resident Evil. Its success, and the success of its sequel, Resident Evil 2, pulled Capcom from the brink of its collapse into an incredibly enviable position of having essentially invented and popularizing a genre, which, interestingly enough, is something they already had some experience with inventing fighting games with Street Fighter. Not only was Resident Evil 1 one of the first examples of survival horror, having coined the term survival horror, it was also the first big hit on the PlayStation 1, a game console that would go on to explode in popularity. And seeing the success of Resi 1, the industry jumped on the horror trend. Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, Clock Tower, Fear Effect, and even Capcom's very own Dino Crisis would fill out the early works of survival horror. And that's only on the PlayStation 1. Fear was a hot commodity, and everyone wanted a piece. Capcom was in a especially good position to take advantage of that interest, pumping out sequels and spin-offs of Resident Evil one after another to similar success. But over the years, much like how fighting games eventually started to peter off in popularity, the mainstream interest in horror began to wane, and Capcom started to pivot away from pure survival horror, with Resident Evil 1 and 2 having a relatively small amount of action, to Resident Evil 3 substantially increasing the amount of combat. The games started to veer closer and closer to action games than horror games. They were still definitively survival horror games, but they started creeping closer. And when the time came to make Resident Evil 4, Capcom was in a bind. If they returned to their pure survival horror origins, they'd risk being spurned by general audiences who had gotten a taste for more action-oriented game designs. And if they hard committed to action, they risked alienating the audience who had been beating the drum of survival horror since the beginning. This situation caused the development of Resident Evil 4 to be troubled, to say the least. The game was partially completed and restarted multiple times over the course of its development. The first attempt at RE4 was so action-focused that it split off and became an entirely different game with 2001's Devil May Cry, widely considered to be the grandfather of the character action genre, inspiring games like God of War and Ninja Gaiden. Subsequent versions would fall back on fixed camera perspectives of the previous Resident Evil games. One of the surviving examples of these spookier attempts was the Hookman demo, which portrayed a much more psychologically horror-focused angle to its gameplay, and featured a constant ghostly pursuer similar to the tyrant, Mr. X from Resident Evil 2. Aside from the version of the game that would eventually come to release, there were 4 total unreleased versions of Resident Evil 4. Capcom's internal development was pulling back and forth, trying to guide the ship never to sway too hard to one side, course-correcting if they went too far into action or to old-school horror. In most stories like this, where the game is constantly being restarted over and over, they either never come out or are released as half-baked hack jobs trying to salvage the massive losses on their multi-year development cycles. But RE4 was a smash hit, becoming one of Capcom's best-selling games at the time of its release. The game, much like the first Resident Evil, reoriented the entire industry, but it also reoriented its genre as well. And the boat that was so carefully steered to maintain balance between horror and action hit an iceberg of innovation. The game simply played too well to ignore its strengths. The shooting, the flow, action combat, perfection. The horror had no choice but to take a back seat. It was still present in the game to be sure, but partly due to its rocky development cycle, it had this campy, thrown-together vibe, at times going pants-on-head crazy, more so than any of its predecessors. That tone further diluted the sense of fear, and due to that and its immaculate gameplay, it forked from the standard survival horror genre into a new-founded action horror subgenre. It would turn out to be a wildly popular shift, and those who could not keep up with this change would be left behind. Series like Silent Hill and Dino Crisis failed to adapt quickly enough to these changing times. Many more games would fall through the cracks as the tide of action horror and action games in general flooded all parts of the industry. Pure horror became buried. Why try and make a horror game that will prove to be more difficult to develop and less popular than an action game that can follow a formula laid out by RE4 and make way more money serving the preferences of a larger, more Western audience? So developers made the logical choice. Horror, at least as it existed before Resident Evil 4, died. And that's how it was for years. Great horror games did come out after RE4, but mostly used horror as an action enhancer. Games like Bioshock or Fear would use the scares as more of set dressing than meaningful parts of their game design. Just something to break up combat encounters and add to the atmosphere. And don't get me wrong, I love blasting freaks, but to call these games horror games would be like calling Costco a free sample store. Like, yes, there are a lot of free samples at Costco, but you don't go to Costco for the free samples. You go there to buy paper towels. Like a lot of paper towels. By 2009, and the release of Resident Evil 5, the situation for horror felt dire. The former flag-bearer of the genre had fallen head over heels for the aforementioned freak blasting, to the point that the newest mainline entry would be built from the ground up for co-op. Thus, moving from the realm of freak blasting to freak annihilation. For me, 2008's Dead Space signaled the limit of how far mainstream developers were willing to go back into true survival horror. And Dead Space is basically just Resident Evil 4 in space. I'm being reductive, but I really need to illustrate how shackled to RE4 all these games were. Dead Space, despite my love for it, is mostly just an action game. A really good action game, but an action game. It felt like horror was destined to melt into nothing more than some decorations for developers to throw up in an attempt to spice up the theming of their games. But then something happened. A game started to get talked about, not by big studios and their advertising departments. People were posting about it on this up-and-coming website called YouTube. And this game was terrifying.
What do I do?
Its name was Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Amnesia is owed a debt of gratitude from every single horror game liker that draws breath today. The lovely people over at Frictional Games took one look at the state of horror circa 2007 and said, No, No. First releasing the Penumbra trilogy, they perfected a type of horror that focused almost entirely on disempowering the player, giving them almost no means to fight back against the horror contained within their digital walls. The player lacking any means to defend themselves must rely only on running and hiding, only giving the outcome of escape or death. The former only leaving you with a momentary reprieve, with the possibility of further danger down the line, a substantial difference to simply removing the threat as combat systems tended to do in horror games. And Penumbra's spiritual sequel leans even further into that disempowerment. Amnesia takes the player into a confusing and eldritch Prussian castle with no memories of who they are and no idea of what's going on, forced to march deeper into the stony bowels of the castle Brennenburg as darkness closes in. The plot follows a man named Daniel, who finds himself hunted by a creeping, fleshy, mold-like pursuer called the Shadow, immediately after completely wiping his own memory, trying to save himself from what feels like an inevitable fate of being consumed by this mysterious force. But what matters is not the game's plot, but rather how the game makes you experience it. As it did everything its contemporaries didn't. Then modern horror would load the player with more guns and ammo that they could ever need. Amnesia gives you a lamp, a crippling fear of the dark, and a sprint key. The game does everything it can to make the player feel weak. You have to constantly manage both your physical and mental well-being, both from the dangers of the castle itself and the character's inability to keep his shit together. Daniel can't stand darkness, and simply being in it will slowly drain his sanity, which is unfortunate, considering you need the cover of the aforementioned Merc to hide you from the mangled homunculi that prowl the depths of Brennenburg. And don't even think about looking what you're hiding from, as viewing it causes even worse mental damage to you. In fact, pretty much everything that's slightly out of the ordinary will cause mental damage to Daniel. Books falling over, doors swinging open, kinda just walking down a hallway sometimes. The game has this wonderful effect to warp and distort your character's perspective, twisting and tilting your camera to make it feel like you're really in Daniel's shoes, and it actually enhances the horror experience most of the time.
What's happening? Oh, it feels like my chest is going to burst.
Daniel feels like a regular man being thrust into extreme scenarios. While Chris Redfield was punching boulders in a volcano, Daniel Amnesia was taking actual quantifiable mental damage from simply looking at a monster. With its breaking into the mainstream with the help of various Let's Players, Amnesia's release felt like a rubber band binding the horror genre to its action-oriented subcategory, suddenly snapping and let loose a flurry of possibilities in the genre overall. Much like how Resident Evil 4 finally allowed for a very widely applicable control method to be easily replicated, Amnesia's success signaled that horror had an audience outside of just action horror. And even if large publishers still wouldn't budge and throw a bone to a team that had a desire to make a horror game, Amnesia's success would show that with the help of digital distribution via Steam and a little bit of viral marketing, developers wouldn't have to wait for permission to make the type of horror that was so thirsted by so many of its fans. You see, by the time that Amnesia had come out, the independent scene was already standing on the precipice of what has been nearly a decade-and-a-half-long indie game renaissance. Small teams, or even solo devs, had the capability of making their ideas come to fruition via the ease of distribution that Steam began to widely provide around the 2010s, as well as easy access to general-purpose games engines such as Unity, Godot, and even RPG Maker. It meant that anybody with the drive to make something had the tools to do it and the means to share it. Social media sites like YouTube made self-advertisement easy, even for work-in-progress games like Minecraft and Terraria, who gained fame before their release by simply posting dev footage, and in Terraria's case, made a whole dev Let's Play.
Hey all, this is Blue, here with Redigit. We're actually going to do an LP of Terraria.
And horror games were perfectly suited to benefit from this model of development and release. Now before I go any further, and explain what I mean, I just want to say up front that I have no background in development, and am a bit of a dumbass who cannot begin to comprehend the amount of work and dedication it takes to make what is essentially a minor miracle that is creating a video game. But with that being said, horror games tend to be smaller projects, and can be made more easily by fewer people. They can accomplish their design goals without the use of high-fidelity graphics that cost millions of dollars to create. As it turns out, you don't need things to look cutting-edge to be scary. Sometimes it actually serves the horror to have lo-fi graphics. Five Nights at Freddy's very famously originated its uncanny art style due to its creator, Scott Cawthon, being told that his very much not intended to be scary 3D characters in previous works looked nightmarish. On top of this, the speed at which some devs worked resulted in an immense amount of games coming out in rapid succession. Bite-sized horror games expressing and exploring new ideas quickly and in interesting ways. This rapid pace of iteration led to new ideas being attempted, copied, and propagated to new projects that then did the same, repeating over and over, forming new styles of horror in record time. From Amnesia's disempowerment, you had various works, such as Frictional themselves, attempting to follow up their success with various sequels and spiritual sequels, along with countless other indie teams making similar attempts at horror using Amnesia as a framework to their design. Five Nights at Freddy's, as I mentioned before, took the same feeling of helplessness and turned it into an almost puzzle-like horror game where you couldn't even run from the monsters that were attacking you. Only try and hold them back as you sat in an isolated security room, managing resources efficiently while trying to learn all the tells of the haunted animatronics that were trying to kill you. And of course, the return of classic Resident Evil-style survival horror with fixed camera perspectives and inventory limits. Games like Crow Country and Signalis, to name a few, would pick up where Resident Evil 3 left off in 1999. And then you have even truer capital S survival horror games with the likes of Forest and Darkwood, making the act of surviving the primary focus, with both hunger systems and base building tending to set themselves in a more open environment. And you can't forget about RPG horror games either. Fear and Hunger and Look Outside have become recent obsessions of mine. If you watched the previous video at least, it becomes very clear. I could sit here all day and rattle off indie horror game after indie horror game that I've come to love and admire over the years. And all of them emerged in large part due to Amnesia's success. Amnesia saved horror, and maybe that's something that was inevitable. Maybe if Frictional hadn't been the ones to do it, then some other team would have come along and revived it themselves. But I'm glad it was them. As of now, Frictional continues to put out great stuff. One of which, Soma, stands as a towering achievement of horror scenario writing. I couldn't have hoped for a better group of people to have kicked off this revival. I don't know if you could tell, but I love horror. These games, these experiences, they allow us to go beyond the limitations that so many genres have. Horror is an inherently emotional and to a degree irrational type of experience. To willingly seek out that which causes us discomfort, so we may be artistically challenged. It's easy to feel comfortable. It's profitable to make comfortable feeling art. That's why the genre's propagation was so important. It gave people that drive to challenge themselves artistically, and the opportunity to do so. Horror almost slipped fully into that pit, disappearing forever. And I'm glad to have been here to watch it climb back out. Thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it, and why not hit that subscribe button? I plan to make more of this stuff. The last video I made did way better than I thought it ever would. And if you found me because of that video and watched it and supported it, then I didn't get the opportunity to say thank you at the end of it because I just kind of put it out. I didn't really think it would be seen by anybody. So I guess congratulations, you found the secret thank you to the previous video. But if you're here and you're new, thank you all the same. I'm really enjoying doing this, and I have a lot more ideas that I want to put out. So, hey, if this is also as good as the last one, then I guess I got a good thing going. But I also have an email. I put it in the description. There's a link to it. If you have any questions or want to send me anything, you want to send hate mail, there, that's the method, I suppose. But yeah, no, I thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And y'all have a wonderful day.